Hi, I'm Dr. Pologi, Ben Pologi. Once again, to make sure you know who I am, I'm a psychologist. I've been practicing in New York City for 25 years. Um, this is a video log of cases and all things psychological. And today I'd like to talk about uh, a guy named Evan. That's not his real name. All names and identifying biographical information are changed when I present cases. Also, the people in question have given me their permission to talk about them in this disguised form. And yes, it's again cold in my office. Heat's on. Give it a few minutes. I like to talk about Evan because it illustrates something that's very central, and that is two things. One, why get in touch? People ask me that still. Why talk about your feelings? Why do that? And two, the difference between insight, which is an emotional experience that sort of pervades your whole self, versus intellectual learning, which only happens up here. It can be fun, but it doesn't have any impact. And that's why things like self-help books, weekend training sessions, seminars, classes, um, these things can be therapeutic. They can be comforting. They can help a little bit, but they aren't going to really reach into the core and root out problems. That requires something more powerful. Now, this is not the best example I'll have of this difference, insight versus not insight. I will have more in future weeks, but I want to give this one now for reasons I'll tell you at the end. Evan came to me. I'm going to have to use my notes here. Can't memorize all this stuff. Evan was struggling with the idea of breaking up with his wife. He couldn't make a decision. He had this immobilizing fear that he would lose contact with his 5-year-old son, to whom he was very devoted, even if the couple had joint custody. Now, the wife wasn't about to contest custody or visitation. Both of the parents were settled in their community. They were not engaging in what's called in the courts parental alienation. They weren't trying to prejudice the kid against the other parent and divide loyalty. There wasn't any of that going on, and neither really wanted full-time custody. They were each very willing to cooperate. But even if he had lost custody, even if he became a weekend dad, it wasn't likely that he would lose his son. Evan had been attending support groups and had discussed some of these concerns, this fear of losing his family, fear of being alone, even if you want the marriage to end, people are afraid of being alone, fear of missing the spouse despite how bad the relationship had become, and fear of losing one's children in the battle for affections. A friend who knew the family well had pointed out, actually several friends had pointed this out, that the quality of his time with his son, even if it were to decline in number of hours per week, was going to improve because the wife wouldn't be there. Now, the wife was a tense, somewhat frantic and fragile woman who had some trouble being calm around the family because she knew that her husband really didn't love her anymore, and she was very hurt by that. But with all this counsel, Evan would try to take it to heart and make a decision and get on with his life, but he was feeling shaky. He became shaky in all of his other activities. That's why he contacted me. It was originally, I can't make this decision, but he understood that, well, okay, this is a big decision. But then he became shaky everywhere else. He was indecisive and uncertain and had moments of being almost sort of paranoid, thinking people are talking negatively about him or don't appreciate him or that he's not good enough to be appreciated. All these kinds of doubts that he had never struggled with before, as far as he could remember. And he would say to me, all this stuff I'm learning and the stuff that I was saying to him, it doesn't cut it for me. I'm just sure I'd lose my son. I don't see how it would work. I still get shaken by the idea of leaving. I think it'd be a mess. And then he would immediately say, but that's preposterous. I know my son knows that his mom is a sweet, wonderful woman, but she gets silly and not to take what she says too seriously. I know he doesn't take anything to heart. I know we're close. He's always come to me for the sort of grounded guidance and when something is serious, and he goes to mom for fun, for his fun, and he loves her too. He knew all this, and he would go back and forth in session, sometimes rather monotonously between these two points of views. And this is an example of why intellectual learning, it wasn't cutting it. It wasn't touching whatever was so disturbing to him inside. and he couldn't make this decision, and he was becoming so shaky in general. Now, bear in mind, Evan is not the kind of guy who was indecisive. Evan was a law enforcement officer. He was a firearms instructor. He was a mountain climber, a biker. He led wilderness trips for adults and kids. It was simply not his style to be indecisive or worried. He wasn't a blustery blowhard, a guy who runs around like a kid going, I ain't scared. He was patient with other people and their indecision and their needs. He was known as a strong but very gentle trip leader, instructor, police officer. Now, I met the son, and so I got a good chance to check that the boy was as Evan described him, was really wise beyond his years, completely aware that his mom, wonderful as she is, was not to be taken too seriously when she started complaining about Evan, about his dad. And he really did know that. He sat in my office grinning affectionately as he talked about her with a kind of wisdom that I see in people 10 times his age. And he said, in his words, she's really fun, but she gets like that. I don't listen when she starts up about dad. It's a 5-year-old boy, or maybe 6 at the time. So what was going on here? Well, Evan was lying to himself. Not consciously, not because he's bad, and I don't use the word lying as any kind of judgmental, pejorative word. It's something that we all do, and if any of you have seen the introductory video that I put on this blog, where I talk about myself and a lie I've always caught myself in, you know what I mean by lies. We all do it. Some of us do it a lot, some of us do it a little. And that's where the trouble starts. All the troubles that mess up our lives really can be understood as coming out of lying to ourselves. And I will explain that as we go. It's too much to get into right now. Let me just mention that there's a reason I titled my book that. Because that really is the truth. And again, I'm not talking about conscious lies. I'm talking about what we do unconsciously. It's very hard to identify how we do that. It's very hard to find your way out of it. You may need a guide. You may need a therapist. But that's the problem. Let's return to Evan, though. So what Evan was not seeing was that he was lying to himself when he said, but that's preposterous. My kid won't do that. I know that. He didn't know that. I'll tell you what he learned was really going on with him. And when he saw this, it was not up here. It was something he felt, and he wept a little bit. And what he realized was that despite all the words he was saying, and despite all the words he was hearing, and despite all the evidence in his life of how functional he is, of how confident he is, how self-assured, what he really felt was, in his words, profoundly forgettable. It was coming out, it was triggered by this possibility of not living with his son full time. But that feeling was what was being, but the feeling predated the birth of his son. That goes back to his own childhood. Profoundly forgettable. That was the phrase that he came up with. That his son would quickly and effortlessly forget about him. He described to me these images he had in his bad moments. Late at night, perhaps when he had a drink or two in him and he was just complaining to a friend. Images of himself as this skinny, sort of easily blown away person. Now, this guy was a weightlifter, but believe me, he wasn't skinny or in any way brush offable. He was built like a brick wall, a big brick wall. But his image of himself was as skinny, the wind could blow him away, and this picture of his son would come to his mind, his son and his mother, and his son and his mother with other people, laughing, enjoying a great time, and if Evan's name came up, it would just be laughed off as completely trivial, as laughable. These were the images that haunted him, but he was barely aware of them, mostly unaware. He kept pushing them away. That's what was torturing him. Now, why is this important? How do we know this is true? How do we know this matters? How do we know I'm not just spinning out stories? How do we know I'm not inventing something to fill up the therapy session and give him something to hold on to? Because when he became aware of it, two things happened. One, he became aware of feeling that way many times in his life, but he always pushed it aside. He always forgot about it. Forgot is, I need my hands. Forgot goes in quotes. He didn't forget. It's an unconscious, Freud called it repression. It's an unconscious process. He pushed it aside, and that's lying to oneself. But those memories were there, and they fueled a lot of his discomfort, some of his sleepless nights, some of his symptoms, including some gastrointestinal trouble that went away. And that's the second reason we know that we're onto something here. When he felt this stuff, when he remembered both the memories of feeling that way at various times in his life, especially his young life, and when he realized that that's how he felt about his son, at that moment, almost literally at that moment, all of his symptoms went away. He sat up. Previously, he'd been sort of an apologetic figure in the office. He would sort of sit, I don't want to move the camera, but my couch is over there. He would sit sort of huddled in it, sort of in a corner, this big man. And he somehow managed to look small. And he would give me sheepish grins and he'd sort of try to laugh things off. Suddenly he sat up, and there his full presence resumed. And excuse me a second. He took command, as I imagined he always did. Hang on one second.